Before, whenever I've needed to cut out a circle or a part of a circle like this, I've had to measure first with my tape measure, mark it with a compass, and then cut it at the bandsaw, being careful to stay away from the line, and then sanding up to the line on a disc sander for outside curves or a drum sander for inside curves. And results were always mixed. So I thought it was time to make my own circle cutting jig for the router, and I'm going to use this router. It's the DeWalt 618, but this jig is adaptable to virtually any router. And I'm going to use commonly available materials. This is 1/2 inch MDF and 1/4 inch MDF, and the hardware is just about as simple. This is a brass machine screw, 1/4 inch in diameter, 2.5 inches long, and it has 20 threads per inch. This is a draw bolt. The only part of it I'm going to use is the rectangular nut, because it fits the machine screw. And this is going to become the pivot pin assembly for the jig, so I also need a way of tightening it. As simple as a wing nut with a washer. The next step up would be a threaded knob, or my favorite, this is a lever action cam clamp. You have to get this at a woodworking store, but this is what I'm going to use. I need some wood screws. These are number 6 by 5/8 of an inch. And 2 other screws, but I'll talk about these later. The only place I could find the draw bolt was at Home Depot. So I just bought everything else at Home Depot also, other than the cam clamp that I had to buy at Woodcraft. I'm going to start by working on the pivot pin. I've got the machine screw chucked in the drill press just to hold it. I'm not turning the drill press on just yet. I need to cut the head of the screw off. And if I wanted to do it manually, which I don't, I could use a hacksaw, which I'm not. The way I'm going to do it is with a cutoff wheel in a Dremel. Next, I need to grind down the last 1/2 inch of this machine screw. That's going to become the pivot pin. The good thing about brass, it's a soft enough metal that it's easily worked with ordinary hand tools. The one I'm going to use is just an ordinary flat file. Notice, due to the rotation of the bit, which way I've got the file aimed. And I'm going to do this real time. I'm not going to cut away, so you can see just how easy this is. And that should be enough. And I don't know what diameter that is. I don't really care because I've got an inexpensive set of numbered drill bits I bought at Harbor Freight. Good thing about numbered drill bits, each drill bit is just thousandths of an inch different from its neighbor. So one of these drill bits is going to match and be able to drill a pivot hole that will fit this pivot pin. Now, if you don't want to buy another set of drill bits or you don't have numbered drill bits, you can file the pivot pin down until it matches a hole of a drill bit that you do have. Next, I want to permanently affix the nut to the pivot pin, and I'm going to use JB Weld, but clear epoxy would work as well. I also want to make sure the pivot pin part does not extend more than a ½ inch beyond the nut. By the way, the bit turned out to be a number 7 that fit my pivot pin, and I've drilled a hole in this scrap piece of ½ inch MDF, and I'll use it to make sure the pivot pin doesn't extend further than below that ½ inch MDF. I'm also going to let it cure in there, so I'm sure that the rectangular nut and the pin will dry perpendicular. The base of the router is 6 inches in diameter, so I'm going to cut a piece of the 1/4 inch MDF 6 inches wide. And at the miter saw, I'll cut it to its final length of 41 inches. And this length is going to make it long enough that with my router, I'll be able to cut a 36-inch radius circle, or in other words, a 6-foot diameter tabletop. Next, I want to locate the router base on the MDF. The DeWalt router uses 4 mounting screws, and I want to be fairly precise about it. I don't just want to do it on here randomly. So I've drawn a vertical centerline 3 inches from either side. I also measured down 3 inches and drew a horizontal line. It's on these 2 axes I will locate those 4 mounting screws. And the DeWalt base plate mounts with these panhead screws. They're flat on the bottom, so I'm going to counter bore with a Forstner bit first for the screw heads, and then I'll drill all the way through with a bit that will match the screw body. Next, I want to route a center slot for the nut to ride in, so it's got to be the width of the nut, which is just a little over 1/4 inch. I want the slot to start a little bit away from the edge of the router base and stop 1 inch from the other end. You may also notice I've already drawn the outside lines of the shape I want my jig to be. I think the classic shape is tapered for this type of jig and with rounded ends, but the outside shape doesn't affect the functioning of the jig whatsoever. At the router table, I've mounted a 1/4 inch router bit in the router, and I've adjusted the fence far enough away that when I run the workpiece through with one edge against the fence and then flip it over with the other edge against the fence and run it through again, the 2 passes combine to make a slot just the right width for the nut. And I tested it with this cutoff piece from the workpiece. So the nut fits in that slot. It's always more convenient to have your measuring device as part of your tool or your jig, so I'm going to embed this self-stick tape measure alongside the slot in the base of my jig. I don't want the tape just sitting on the surface of the MDF because it is steel and it would scratch any work surface I'm running the jig across. So I'm going to route a very shallow channel alongside the slot. In the router table, I've already set it up with a 3/4 inch straight bit and the fence adjusted so that it will route about a 1/2 inch wide channel alongside the slot. Ordinarily, I would do what I said earlier. I would take this to the bandsaw and cut around the curve, staying away from the line, and then I would take it over to the disc sander and sand up to the line because I don't have a circle cutting jig for my router, except that I do. So you're getting a free preview of the subject of my next video. This is the small circle router jig, and what you're seeing is a prototype for it. In my next video, I'll make the permanent jig. At the drill press, I've got a 1.5 inch hole saw mounted. I'll use the same center for its pilot bit, and I'll drill part way through from both sides so I don't get a big blowout on the back. Next, I want to cut the tapers on the sides, and the way I'm going to do it, I've cut these wooden keys, which are just blocks that fit in the center slot. I've hot glued one at that end of the slot, and now I'll hot glue the other one. I'm gluing them to this sled. I wasn't comfortable just using my hands to hold the jig or the workpiece while I run it through the table saw. I've set the fence the width of this sled board, and now I'll run it through. Now I can flip the workpiece over and run it through for the second side, and they'll be exactly the same cut. this curve on this end, I don't have any choice. I'll have to cut it at the bandsaw and then sand it at the disc sander. The DeWalt base has these two holes for steel rods that are used with an edge guide, and on top of those they're drilled in tapped holes that are used for screws that tighten down on the steel rods. These holes go all the way through the router base. I've drilled matching holes in the MDF. Next, the 1/4 inch MDF needs a stiffening strip down the center from the 1/2 inch MDF. So I've got the table saw rip fence set up for a 2-inch cut. I'm also going to scribe the base to one end of that 2-inch strip. I'll cut that at the bandsaw and then sand it on the drum sander. And I'll cut to rough length of 35.5. This is where the stiffening spine will go on the jig, tied up against the router base and extending to the end. I need to mark where a 1/4 inch centered slot will begin and end on it, so I'll hold it up against the base of the router, turn it over, and I'll mark the beginning and ending of the slot so I can cut it at the router table. And now at the router table, I've got a 1/4 inch router bit set up, the fence 1 inch back from the center of the bit. I'll make a plunge cut at the starting mark and I'll end it at the stopping mark. Now I want to fasten the 1/4 inch MDF to the 1/2 inch MDF, and you can see I've already pre-drilled screw holes for the number 6 by 5/8 inch wood screws. The end of the 1/2 inch MDF that I scribed to the router base, I'm going to make sure is butted up against the router base. And I also want to make sure the slots line up. And I'm going to use the pivot pin hardware as I now pre-drill through the 1/4 inch into the 1/2 inch. I'm going to use the pivot pin hardware to make sure those slots line up. And I'm going to start with this end hole. I also want to be sure and countersink the screws enough so these steel screw heads are not going to scratch up any work surface I run them across. I'll do that one some more. Next, I want to install the tape, mounting it in that shallow channel I routed. And I want to zero it on the center of the bit, so I've installed a V-groove bit, and that's not a mistake. I do want to zero it on the center of the bit. But I'm going to have to cut the tape off about 2.5 inches here because I didn't route the channel any closer than that. So I'm going to lose the zero mark on the tape. So what I'll do, I'll line the zero up with the center of the bit, and I'll make a mark where 5 inches is. Now when I cut the tape off, I'll still have the zero mark I can line it up with. One more thing, I need to trim the 1/2 inch MDF to match the 1/4 inch MDF. I'll do that roughly at the bandsaw and then use a flush trim bit. works on this jig. If you recall, I zeroed it at the center of the bit. But I never measure anything to the center of the bit. I'm always either concerned about this inside edge or the outside edge, and it depends on whether I'm routing the outside diameter of a circle or the inside diameter of a circle. So here, an inside radius, I'm using the outside edge of the bit. An outside radius, I'm using the near side of the bit, near to the pivot pin. And because I zeroed it on the center of the bit, I would ordinarily line up the pivot pin with whatever measurement, but then I have to mentally add or subtract 1/8 of an inch to account for the difference between the center of the bit and the cutting edge. So instead, I drew lines 1/8 of an inch away from the center of the pivot pin. And if I'm routing using the inside edge, I line up this inside mark with whatever measurement I want. So using the inside edge of the bit to route the outside curve, I would line up the inside mark that I've made on the sliding nut. So if I wanted a 5-inch circle, I'd line up this mark with the 5. If I'm routing an inside curve, I'm measuring to the outside edge of the bit, so I use the outside mark on the rectangular nut, and I would line that mark up with the 5. So that's how the tape measure works. That way I don't have to mentally do math. If I were to use a 1/2-inch bit, I would make 2 more marks that were a 1/2 inch apart from each other. Another point, I don't always want to drill a hole in my workpiece, but that's how this jig is set up. I have to drill, in this case, a number 7 hole with my numbered bit, and put the pivot pin in that and then route my circle. Don't always want to do that, so I have another option. Sometimes you need to bring your own hole if you don't want to drill a pivot hole in your workpiece, and that's what this is. It's a 2-inch square. The 2 inches isn't so important, but being exactly square is. But it's a 2-inch square of the 1/2-inch MDF. I drew lines joining the 4 corners, and right in the middle I drilled my number 7 hole for my pivot pin. Now all I have to do is find the center of whatever in my workpiece of wherever I want the pivot to be, the hole, the center, and draw 90-degree lines across it, and then line these up, line the corners up with the lines on my workpiece. Carpet tape it down to the workpiece, and that becomes my pivot point, but that presents a problem. At the router end, it needs to be propped up a 1/2 inch also. So I cut a 6-inch square of the 1/2 inch MDF, and if you recall those 2 holes that were through holes in the router base, I drilled them through the 1/2 inch MDF also, and that's what those 2 other screws were for. On the DeWalt router, the threads are metric, they're number 6, so I've got number 6 by, I think these are 40mm screws. But I would tighten these down, but before I do, I need to drill a hole to match the one here. I also drew an outline of the jig base, and I'll trim that at the bandsaw, and then I'll use a flush trim bit to make it match the 1/4 inch MDF. I fasten the 1/2 inch MDF base to the 1/4 inch MDF base with the 2 metric screws. I've got a 1/4 inch bit installed in the router. I'll turn it on and lower the bit until it forms the center hole. And now I can use this center hole for my hole saw. for when I am able to drill a pivot hole in the workpiece, such as the underside of a tabletop, you're usually okay. But if it's a project where I don't want to drill a pivot hole, like a serving platter or a game board, I can bring my own hole. And I've got a sub base to match. I guess I should demo this before I end the video. So I'm going to remake some of the inner wall templates for alcohol stoves that I make, if you've seen other videos of mine. This is the inner wall template for a 7.5 ounce mini can alcohol stove. The two radii, this one, the largest one, is 21 inches and the smaller inside radius is 19.5. And you may remember that when I cut an outside radius like this, I'm actually measuring to the inside edge of the bit. But I zeroed my tape, I should say, on the center of the bit. So, down here at the pivot pin, instead of lining up the center of the pivot pin with 21 inches, I'm going to line up this inside mark with 21 inches. So, measuring to the inside edge of the bit, I'll use the inside mark on the pivot pin. This is some 1/8 inch masonite, and it's sitting on the outfeed table of my table saw, but it's just 1/2 inch plywood. I don't care about cutting through it. I've already drilled my pivot hole down here in the workpiece. This only needs to be 6.5 inches long, or 6 3/4 of an inch long, so I'm not going to cut all the way across. I'll just make a partial arc. Now I've already got the bit lowered, so I'm going to hold the router up and then lower it. Not near enough. That should do it. Now I'm going to make the inside radius, the smaller one, which is 19.5 inches. And remember, when I'm cutting to an inside radius, I'm measuring to the outside edge of the bit, and therefore I'm using the outside mark on the pivot pin. So I've lined this mark up with 19.5 inches, the outside mark. And there are the two cuts, and I'll have to cut these off with either the bandsaw or a saber saw or something. But much cleaner cuts, and I'll go on and do the next 3. Guys, thanks for watching.